Victoria University event, The Fight for Nature, the debate on the future of conservation in New Zealand. I'm Kathryn Ryan, chair for this discussion between our panellists and indeed with you. The plan is for our panellists to make a short opening statement each, then in perhaps 25 minutes or so, when we've been through that, I will be seeking questions from the audience for our discussion to begin. There are two roving mics, we'll have one on each side of the hall. Please signal with a raised hand if you'd like to ask a question and we'll get the microphone to you. Please introduce yourself and ask your question. We would like this discussion to flow. It is very much built around you and your questions. So please, you're very welcome to participate. We'll let it flow for perhaps an hour, even a bit longer, but when we feel like we're there, we'll feel like we're there. We'll come back to the panellists perhaps for just some final thoughts on the conversation. To make sure they can speak as frankly and fully as possible, our panellists are expressing their own opinions. They are not speaking on behalf of any organisation or employer. Please, if you would switch off those cell phones or switch them to silent. Exits and toilets out here, especially if there's a fire alarm. And we will get underway. The topic of the discussion: what will our biodiversity look like in 2100? How should it look? Restorationists say that it should be returned to its ancestral purity before people arrived. They say that without drastic human intervention, particularly to control invasive species, our ecosystems will collapse within a generation. Advocates for reconciliation, on the other hand, deny that human influences on invasive species are only or even largely negative. They claim that resistance to invasion is futile, suggesting that we should instead learn to accept and adapt to the new world of cosmopolitan species and mongrel ecosystems. Who is right? Who gets to decide on the future of our wildlife? I'm going to briefly introduce our panel to each of you, and please welcome them. Emma Marris is an American scientist, a science and environment writer with more than a dozen years of experience writing for print media such as Nature, National Geographic and the New York Times. In her career, she's chronicled the evolution of ecological thought as conservationists grapple with the sweeping impacts of Homo sapiens on Earth. Please welcome Emma. Liz Clarkson is a restoration ecologist interested in habitat restoration to bring indigenous nature back to cities. He leads an MB-funded research program, People, Cities and Nature, Restoring Indigenous Nature in Urban Environments. In 2016, he received the Royal Society of New Zealand Charles Fleming Award for Environmental Achievement. Please welcome Bruce. And over the past 15 years, Dr. Jamie Steer has worked in a range of roles in the environmental services industry, including as an ecologist for an environmental design consultancy. He's published papers on behavioural ecology, bioacoustics and the history of science. No small topic. He currently works as a senior biodiversity advisor at Greater Wellington Regional Council. Please welcome Jamie. Nafanui Emini is an open space and parks manager at Wellington City Council, where she deals with the challenges of integrating nature into a capital city and enabling people to connect with it, and has established an urban ecology team within the council. She takes a pragmatic approach to this challenge, gained from 15 years of practical experience working alongside the community. Please welcome Nafanui. Associate Professor Jacqueline Leeds is the Director of the Centre for Biodiversity and Biosecurity at the University of Auckland. Her research interests include finding ways to mitigate the impact of humans on the environment. She advises the Ministry of Primary Industries on biosecurity and has been a member of the Kakapo Recovery Group since 2001. And Wayne Linklater leads an international research program for the conservation of rhinoceros and elephants, a New Zealand-based research into human-wildlife relationships, and is developing and commercialising pheromone lures for small mammal pest species. He's the director of Victoria University's Centre for Biodiversity and Restoration Ecology, and received the New Zealand Ecological Society's Science Communication Award in 2015. Please welcome. Let's begin, ladies and gentlemen. Emma, because you had to warm up with me a little earlier in the day, I'm going to ask you to begin with your opening statement. Thank you.
This hand mic here?
Yes, please. Thank you.
So I'll start by saying that my perspective is, of course, largely North American, and there's obviously huge differences. That's part of the reason I've come here, is to learn all about how everything works over here. But what I've done for the past 10 or 15 years is sort of chronicle and be engaged with this conversation in conservation biology in North America. And the way that the debate is playing out there is that, now I segue into the right part when I read, that there was a time when we could achieve most of our conservation goals in the same place and with the same methods. So simply by limiting human access or use, or occasionally one-time restoration of lost species, we could achieve extinction prevention, return to a historical reference state, wildness, recreation, beauty, ecosystem services, the whole lot. The current angst in conservation in North America flows from the realization that increasingly often one management approach can't achieve all of our goals in the same spot, and we have to choose. So, for example, if we want wildness, defined as a lack of ongoing intervention, and our sites warming due to climate change or due to habitat fragmentation, it's small, then we might lose local species because they require ongoing management or control of non-native, supplemental feeding, water provisioning, and so on. If we want a native species composition pegged to a particular time, we must often welcome intensive management, and then we have to rule out using that particular site as a haven for species that are moving from elsewhere because of climate change. We also risk system fragility as background conditions like climate change. The fact that all goals can't be accommodated at every site using a single panacea management strategy has led to some spats in the local conservation community about how to proceed. Now, I think that these disputes are largely avoidable by embracing a diverse palette of goals and approaches across large landscape scales. I've become a convert to what Greg Applett at the Wilderness Society in the US calls bet hedging. So here, in any large landscape, you manage roughly a third or so with a classical restoration approach. In New Zealand, this would involve eradication of non-natives and restocking with natives. Then you manage another third with an innovative reconciliation approach with greater emphasis on function than composition, and with the ultimate goal of diversity and resilience in the face of these large-scale stressors like climate change. And then finally, you would manage a third by not managing at all, by allowing the land to become truly wild and allowing nature and evolution to come up with solutions that we humans would never have thought of. The advantage of this approach is that it preserves outcomes that matter to different people. So some care more about nativeness, some more about function, some more about wildness, some are very culturally connected to some non-native species that wouldn't find a good place in a native-only restoration. It also means that we're not putting all of our eggs in one basket in case one of our approaches fails to reach some of our goals. And it's a bit cheaper because the wild third requires only the investment for monitoring. The challenge is, of course, keeping these different treatments, these different management strategies separate. And I think that challenge is much more challenging here in New Zealand than it is in North America, partially because of the importance of non-native pest species as your #1 issue, which is it's somewhere third or fourth or fifth or something like that on the list in North America. But also just because of sort of just the scale of the landscapes that you're working on. Because of the role that cities play as a source of introduced species, you might think that it would be smart to manage the lands nearest the city as your sort of innovation sites or your sort of observation-only sites. But I think that projects like Zealandia show that actually doing a sort of classical restoration right by the city has incredible benefits, not only educationally, culturally, but as the kind of the halo effect, the spillover effect. So I was very pleased to finally tour it after having touted it for many years in talks all over the world as this great example. I was finally thrilled to actually go and see it in person. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Emma. Bruce Clarkson, please.
Kia ora tātou. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to get straight into it. Aotearoa New Zealand's biodiversity is precious and special because of its evolutionary history, a complex of isolated island and continental syndromes. As a recognised biodiversity hotspot and with levels of endemism higher than anywhere else in the world in some groups, we all have a duty to protect and restore our biological heritage. While we hold the record of being the last substantial landmass settled by humans about 800 years ago, we have also transformed our landscapes more significantly in a shorter time span than anywhere else on Earth. Despite this broad-scale transformation and the associated extinctions, there is still the definite prospect of Indigenous biota dominance over large parts of our country. Most Indigenous ecosystems are more resilient than often appreciated. I know this from my own research. Only a subset of exotic species are problematic, and a good number of these can already be eradicated at local and regional scales. The ecological context and evolutionary history of our biota demand development of homegrown management and restoration practice, not based on large continent ecology or a value system which attempted to recreate a Little Britain. Overall, we can keep many ecosystems in an indigenous state without going bankrupt, and restoring ecosystems will be value for money because of the range of ecosystem services they provide. I'm an optimist, aiming at the highest practicable extent of improvement and a rebalancing of the results of 200 years of sometimes systematic removal of Indigenous biodiversity over much of lowland and coastal Aotearoa. Our Indigenous biota just needs half a chance to reassert itself on our landscapes. Once the numbers shift in their favour, and for native plants, the area I know most about, it is just a numbers game, driven by seed rain and seed banks, and it is possible to tip the balance and reconstruct viable Indigenous plant communities. Our biodiversity in 2100 will be in a better state than it is now, largely because we will be well down the track of modern public-private partnerships and community-based and biocultural restoration approaches, as articulated by Norton in 2016. See me later if you want a copy. The false dichotomies, the laissez-faire approach, and straw men characteristic of some extreme reconciliation ecologists will be largely ignored, as they are already, by the hard-working management agency staff and volunteers. Their daily commitment and actions demonstrate passion for our unique biological heritage ahead of the novel ecosystems and unwanted weeds and pests. These will be progressively reduced by manipulating and enhancing and restoring our regional ecologies and landscapes. In the end, it will be the people who decide, and they love our native birds beyond belief. They may need reminding occasionally of the important biota that go with them, and the need to balance pest control with habitat restoration in a broader sense. The current groundswell of support for community restoration and pest control projects heralds a new phase of regional scale restoration. Reconnecting Northland, Wild for Taranaki, Cape to City are all good examples. This regional scale restoration, which includes the new frontier urban restoration, will provide the platform for a reversal of Indigenous biodiversity decline on mainland Aotearoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you, Bruce, and if I could pass that microphone to Nathaniel, please.
Hello. I've promised I'm going to behave and read my piece of paper because else I'd end up all over the place. So I apologise for looking down more than I'd like. So in my job, I work to restore our native biodiversity in the middle of our capital city, and that is done within the myriad of opinions that come with a population of over 200,000 people. When I started with council 15 plus years ago, I was a relatively bright young thing at that point, and I was very much a pure restorationist, so I had my vision. However, time has taught me to be a bit more pragmatic. Our natural environment, like most in the country, has been heavily modified. It's got a complex mixture of species and habitats. We've got urban, suburban, rural areas. And, well, some introduced species pose a threat to our native ecosystems. We also have to recognise that some do not, and they are part of our cultural heritage. Thousands of conversations have taught me to move my focus to actually the benefits and threats provided by species, whether they're native or introduced. And I, on a daily basis, have conversations with people who want to cut down native trees and sterilise all the kaka in Wellington. Had a text this morning, yet another person has got kaka nesting in their ceiling and they would like council to do something about it, so we'll sort that one on Monday. But we also have conversations with people who treasure our native species, and then the only way to protect them is to keep people away from them, so to lock them away. And these conversations are with people across all demographics. One of the beautiful things of working for a city council is we do talk to everybody, not just the people in this room. My job through all this is to find a way through the middle. And through all this, we can't lose sight of the fact that, unlike our introduced species, our endemic species actually don't have strongholds in any other countries. If they're gone from here, they are gone from the world, and our global biodiversity continues to diminish. So I think that's quite a key point to bear in mind. We have to respect the importance of our native biodiversity to this country and its intrinsic right to exist. There's something special in the way, as Bruce has said, about the way that we value our native species. It's the same way that we value a lot of aspects about our unique New Zealandness, and it's something of which we as a country are very proud. And I'm always surprised by the diversity of people who actually talk to me about their experiences, whether that's with kaka or the mokopiriraka or the forest gecko, and the passion I hear in their voices when they do. So here in Wellington, we're in a time where our native species aren't just encountered in remote wilderness areas, which are accessible to the few people that have the time, inclination and resources to see them. They're actually available to everybody, and I think that's pretty special. Our children are growing up with kaka and tieki, with North Island robin and kakariki. And actually in a recent survey that we had some university students do, more people in Wellington could correctly identify a tui than a sparrow. And I think that was amazing. And that's what can be achieved through restoration. And we can bring back the species that have been missing from these areas, and if we don't do that, we'll continue to lose touch with New Zealand's heritage. And now most of our population lives in cities. So if we don't restore our native species to the environment where they live, people won't actually have personal experiences with those species, and then they're less likely to value them. I've heard it said that people actually don't value our native species, and it doesn't feel right to actually make that call when we never gave them the chance to value those species, because we never brought the species to where the people are. And the other important thing in Wellington is that our native biodiversity is actually increasing. And that's not a statement that can be made commonly elsewhere in this country or in the world, so I'm pretty proud of that. One thing we found is that there are a lot of native species that can actually live amongst us, but as part of that, there are conversations that have to be had with our communities about what they're willing to change and what they're willing to accept. So what pest control are they willing to undertake in order to have native species amongst us? Another conversation at the moment is with a group of residents who are vehemently opposed to toxins and threatening to take us to court. So, there are people on both sides of these arguments. But also, what restrictions are they willing to place on their pets? Always contentious. And what kaka damage are they willing to endure? If we turn around and say, sorry, we're going to let this nest of kakas, kind of live in your ceiling for 60 days and good luck to you, then that's probably not an acceptable answer either. So we're asked just to have a think about where we saw ourselves in 2100, and I think we've made huge strides towards living more harmoniously with our native species. We will still have introduced species that give our lives context and that we depend on for our livelihoods, but those are the species that can live amongst us and our native species without threatening their existence. And when we control an animal species, I think the other point is that in the future, and it's increasing now, we've actually done it respectfully, realising their sentience. There's words like kind of war and destruction and everything. We have to realise that these animals actually do have some welfare considerations also. We're going to have a population that lives amongst nature and is actually connected to it. And as a result of that, we'll have a population where our health, both mental and physical, has improved. It's obviously another thing challenging us as a country, so I'm going off topic again, is actually issues around our mental health. But when we restore nature to our cities, we actually can have benefits for people's mental health as well. So in 2100, some of our sensitive native species may still have strongholds in remote areas. We have to accept that, that's absolutely fine. But others are living at the heart of the cities and the places where we spend our time. And because of this, everybody will be connected to the species that make this country unique and value them. Thank you.
Family, thank you. Jamie Steer, please, your opening thoughts.
All right, awesome. Thanks very much, Kathryn. So for me, there were several questions raised in the topic statement, and I'm just going to speak briefly to two of them. So the first question is, of course, what should our ecosystems look like in 2100? And for me, I think a big part of the answer to that question comes down to how we're going to think about the place and the role of introduced wildlife in New Zealand. Because this is a huge part of biodiversity management in this country and what a lot of it revolves around. So managing a subset of introduced biota that are considered invasive is what most people in the New Zealand conservation industry are focused on, either directly or indirectly. Putting it bluntly, I think that this focus needs to shift. I think that we need to get better at accepting the dynamism of our modern ecosystems and with embracing the diversity of species that we have in this country. For me, that includes accepting the presence in more areas of many of the species that we currently consider to be invasive as well. Let me be clear, this is not a choice between purity or obliteration that we have here. Sure, there will be losses as well as gains. Some especially valued but vulnerable native species are going to continue to need intensive management to survive in our contemporary environment. Let's make those areas the exception though, not the rule. Elsewhere, let's learn to better appreciate what we have. As many of you will be aware, New Zealand now has a greater species richness than it did before people arrived. We've gained more than we've lost. So let's ease up a little bit on the epitaphs and the doomsaying. Ultimately, our biotic diversity in New Zealand will mirror the diversity of our human society, part new, part old, hybrid, mixed, mongrel, dynamic, thriving. Turning now to the second and perhaps the most fundamental question, who should decide on the future of our wildlife? Again, I'll be blunt, we've failed to really engage with our communities on this. Our values for wildlife have been driven to an unreasonable extent by scientists, and particularly by natural scientists like myself. And there are few industries that are so comprehensively dominated by the white middle to upper classes in conservation. Just take a look around this room today if you don't believe me. We desperately need new voices in this space. And no, this is not just about social license. It's not just about how we're going to get the public to agree with our predetermined ideas about how we think nature should be. We have to pull in the voices that have been excluded now for decades. And that includes those of the species that we once introduced for pleasure and profit, and that we now target for control and eradication. We don't get to wipe our hands of them now that they're an issue. We won't get away with it so easily this time. For me, the paradigm of conservation is shifting. It's shifting from one of restoration and retrospection to one of reconciliation and adaptation. This is partly a generational change. Some people in New Zealand still want us to focus most of our attention on conserving native species and ecosystems as they were in the past. But I say that's not conservation, that's stamp collecting. We need to be thinking broader, more holistically, and especially more inclusively about our ecosystems now. We need to be asking new questions and canvassing more voices to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I think you have a little visual. I'm looking forward to seeing it, please. Perhaps it's a chance. Who's going to help me out with the microphones? Do you want to come and take the roving mics, perhaps? And we'll just get set up so we can begin the discussion. Are you going to control things from there, Jack?
No, that's all I need.
You're a step ahead of me. Thank you very much. It'll just, well, we're probably still 2 or 3 or 4 minutes away. Thanks very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, Jacqueline Beck.
So, kia ora tātou. This 1850 painting of my Ngāti great-great-grandmother, Eono, really fascinates me. And when I was younger, it was mostly her eyes, which looked just like my father's, and the moko I thought was amazing. But as I moved on, it was her headdress that really fascinated, because, what's that? Huia feathers. So, just a few generations ago, huia was part of my great-great-grandmother's world, and I doubt that she would really conceive of a world where huia were part of that world. And yet they've gone extinct. And it's really, you know, we've had several speakers say now that New Zealand's natural world, you know, it was made up of all sorts of amazing species, and still is. But with the arrival of humans, of course, and our kin followers, there have been dramatic changes. It's a grave mistake to think that we are at some sort of equilibrium here. Yes, we've lost a number of species, but there are at least 900 native species that are approaching extinction. So we're not done, folks. We have a choice to make, and it's a value judgment for sure as to whether we value the native biodiversity enough to do something and retain what we can, or whether we say, oh well, let's just see how it plays out. So my 4 minutes isn't really long to articulate a lifetime of thinking and working in conservation in New Zealand, and certainly my perspective has changed over the years, but I think some of my basic core values and beliefs are what really inform my approach, and so I just thought I would clarify what those were. So there's 5 of them. And the first is that, as several speakers have already said, we need to be guided by what the evolutionary and biogeographical context of New Zealand is. So New Zealand is different from many or most other parts of the world. We evolved without mammalian predators, we're isolated from other large land masses, and humans arrived relatively recently. So our context is different, and we need to obviously take that on board in order to think about where we've come from and where we need to go. I strongly believe that we have a responsibility to do what we can retain as much of the characteristic native biodiversity that we have. If we don't do it here, as has already been said, we lose it and it will be lost to the world forever. I also think when we're planning on what we need to do, that we need to use science as much as possible to inform our decision making, and I include Mataranga Māori in that body of science. And so we actually know a lot what will happen if we take that do-nothing approach. We're going to lose more native species. That's very clear. It doesn't mean that our systems will collapse. Nature has a way of asserting itself, and some species will flourish given the circumstances that we have in New Zealand now, but they're often not our native species, and they're often not the species we value. So some recent research that I've been doing in an agricultural setting was looking at an agricultural intensification in gradient, and we were looking at the insect pollinators, and what we found is if you go to the extreme and turn all of the landscape into agriculture, the pollination stays there because a whole pile of introduced flies come in, and they're actually quite good pollinators, and so you have the pollination there. But what's happened is all the native bees have dropped out. So we have a choice in that agricultural system. Do we keep allowing more and more intensification? And we still have the pollination happening because we have these exotic flies coming in, and all is good in terms of that process being covered off, but we've lost our native bees. Personally, I'm voting for the native bees. Just back off a little. Oh yes. So if we want many of our native species to be around in 2100, then we're going to have to fight for them. We know what those leading causes of decline are: habitat loss and invasive species in the case of New Zealand. But we also have plenty of evidence that if we fight back on those things, if we try and control or eradicate some of those key invasive species, then we can turn it around. So, and that, we've demonstrated that time and time again in New Zealand, particularly on our offshore island, and that success has led a whole raft of people to get on board with conservation in New Zealand. And we have people all over the country in all sorts of habitats now, planting, weeding and managing pests, and it's making a difference. We are able to secure and bring back many of those differences. So congratulations, Wellington. Delighted to see Kathryn back. So my fourth value is really around social equity, and for me this is a critical thing. I believe that everybody should be able to benefit from our natural resources, and I've already heard said that there's strong evidence now that connection between people and nature is really fundamental to our well-being and happiness, and I believe that connecting with native species is a really important way to foster that. So some other research I was involved with was looking at which trees were protected across Auckland, and it was kind of obvious when we thought about it, but it's really nice to have the data to show that actually in those lower socio-economic communities, they had far fewer protected trees, and far fewer of those trees were also native. And then another piece of work was showing that where you had fewer trees, you had fewer kiraru. So those lower socio-economic communities are not actually getting the benefits that they could be from nature. And I don't think that's acceptable in this day and age to say, oh, it's fine, we've got it covered off in some of the wealthier suburbs and bad luck everybody else. I also think we need to broaden what our view of conservation success looks like. If we, for instance, can increase kiraru populations back to the point where they could be sustainably harvested, that may challenge many white affluent conservationists, but actually that is an outcome that many Māori would hugely value. And then fifthly, and we've also heard about this, is probably coming last when I said it, but I think that we can really only find appropriate solutions if we think more holistically and start incorporating more ecological realities across the board. So rather than focus so much on economic growth, maybe we have to think about living more within our finite resources. My format's more or less up.
Well, I think you're there, but...
So, last little thought then about what does New Zealand conservation look like in 21. I think we need to embrace thinking more holistically. We're working from the mountains to the sea. We're working across landscapes of natural, rural and urban, and that we think beyond just focusing on the birds. So it's too late for Huia, but how about having Kathryn tell you about it?
Thank you, Jacqueline. Wayne, please, your first thoughts.
Thank you, Kia ora, and welcome. Thank you for coming. Delighted to see you. In 2100, people will be an important and unavoidable part of all ecosystems. We will be routinely genetically modifying old biodiversity, breeding new species, and designing and constructing new ecosystems. We will be doing that on this planet and starting to do it on moons and other planets too. Farmers, doctors and conservationists, to name a few, will be doing this to manage a global environment that is different and changing. The Earth's ecosystems and their biodiversity will be changed at all scales, from their genes to biomes. It will mean that nothing original or pure remains to be restored. But before you think that this is some dystopian vision of environmental apocalypse, I need to tell you that I don't see it that way. At least not about wildlife biodiversity. Our biodiversity and its management will be much improved by 2100. The greatest improvements in New Zealand's biodiversity will have occurred in the peopled landscape that make up 2/3 of our land area currently. Today's urban and rural landscapes will seem like biodiversity deserts to my grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Instead, they will grow up in an urban and rural landscapes that have managed to reconcile biodiversity with the other human values. By achieving this, New Zealand's native biodiversity will have ceased to decline and will be in recovery. Those peopled landscapes will no longer be regarded as impacted, trashy, but as highly prized novel ecosystems for biodiversity. There will also be reserved landscapes, where the ecosystems include mostly original biodiversity, but they will be ecosystems functioning very differently under new environmental regimes, beginning with changes in climate. And they will include native wildlife that have been modified to adapt to new challenges. And they will include exotic species also fulfilling important functions. Thus, reserved landscapes will also be novel ecosystems with novel biodiversity. By 2100, we will also have exported our native biodiversity to the rest of the world. Tuatara on islands warming off Antarctica, Kokako in Madagascar, giant weta in Chile, kiwi in New Guinea, This will make sure that their persistence no longer only depends on us. We are a global community. And they will have been welcomed in those many other countries where they contribute to other new resilient ecosystems for a changed world. All ecosystems will be novel because changes will be forced on us and will not be reversible. They will also be novel because we will make them that way to cope, for us to cope and them to cope in a changed planet. But it should also be this way because the novel ecosystems and biodiversities will be designed pragmatically to serve the diversity of human interests and values better. In the future, biodiversity conservation will depend much less on the fraught idealism of a minority elite who have focused only on wildlife preservation and restoration. Other people, not conservationists, will decide the future of biodiversity. That has always been true, and it will continue to be true in our Western democracy. To make greater progress, therefore, conservationists must build an agenda that serves a greater number of people, that makes biodiversity a greater part of people's lives, and not because of the way you value it. Any plans for the future that do not recognise people in their growing part in ecosystem structure and functioning are fatally flawed. Any plans for the future that do not grow the diversity of perspectives and values that contribute to biodiversity conservation are politically indefensible. Biodiversity reconciliation accommodates people. It is inevitable and it is better. And I want to leave you with one provoking thought. That wonderful Zealandia is not actually a restoration project. It never has been. And if you walk through it, you realise it can't possibly be. It is a reconciliation project.
Well, plenty of food for thought there, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll begin with your questions. Please raise your hands. If you hear someone working the same kind of territory as you'd like to go, then please respond so that we can get a flow going. And same for the panel. Please indicate if you want to respond, and let's try and work reasonably thematically. Let's kick off. Who would like to go first with a question for the panel? Thank you, Sue. If you would also, if you're happy to, just tell us who you are and your interest in this. Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Jeff Flavel. I'm working at DOC, but I'm not representing DOC in what I'm about to ask. My question is there a compelling moral responsibility on people in New Zealand to seek to maintain species and their genetic diversity?
Who would like to respond? Jamie?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, I mean, my perspective is that yes, there is an important responsibility to maintain our native biodiversity, but I think our responsibilities go beyond that. I think our responsibilities also go to our the species that we've introduced as well. So it's not an either-or situation. Remember that in the 19th century, people valued, or particularly colonial Europeans, valued the species that they introduced very highly, and they didn't think terribly much of native species. And our values have changed dramatically since then. They've basically moved 180 around to the situation where we value native nature very highly, and we value introduced species only insofar as they're useful to us. I think in terms of responsibility, I think we do have a responsibility to native species, to introduce species, but we also have a responsibility as well to both native individuals and introduced individuals as well. So we can't always reduce the conversation down to trying to preserve particular populations. And we need to be asking questions sometimes, for example, around is it appropriate, is it morally appropriate to kill 1,000 stoats to save kakapo, for example? Or maybe it is appropriate one year, but maybe it's not appropriate to do every year ad nauseum forever. So we have to start to make some of those decisions about when it's appropriate, when it's not, and when it might be appropriate, for example, to save and invoke our responsibility for kakapo by protecting them in other ways. For example, by a lot of the methods that we currently use. We take them out of their existing ecosystem and put them into an ecosystem where they're safe. Or we invoke other habitat modifications to make their breeding habitat suitable, so on and so forth. We're also having a conversation at the moment about gene editing, but the only conversation that we have about gene editing is how can we kill more stuff? Why can't we be talking about gene editing in terms of making native species more suitably adapted to survive in the modern environment? That's an option too, right? Why don't we consider that stuff? So yeah, I think we have a whole range of responsibilities, and sometimes we deny that full range.
Anyone else want to pick up on that? Sir, just wait for the microphone. There's a gentleman just might be first, he's there.
Hello, Bill Winfield. When Bruce Clarkson gave his introduction, he said that human habitation arrived here 800 years ago, yet he cites our restoration models being 200 years ago. In that intervening period, we lost an incredibly rich biodiversity of megafauna, including major predators and major forest browsers. And so we are now setting a restoration model on what would seem to be a broken system. Would you have any comment on that?
Thank you. Bruce, would you like to respond?
I'm not sure you heard me correctly. I said that humans arrived approximately 800 years ago, yes. But what I was focusing on was the period of early settlement of Europeans and the extreme impact that that period had. No, I'm not. Let me finish. So this is the point. I also need to pick up on the comment that Jamie just made. So philosophically, essentially what he's asking us to believe is that it's not right to kill pests which kill our indigenous fauna and some of our flora. So the question that I've got for him is, what are you asking us to do? We stand by. I heard the threatened species manager from Tasmania speak earlier in the year, who pointed out the conundrum we face here is, if we don't kill them, we're standing by and watching while the Australian possum, the weasel, the stoat, and all of those other animals kill our native wildlife. It is a choice, but it's a conundrum, and I know which side of that conundrum I lie on.
Okay, we're in two parts here. So can we just, I'll come back to you. I'll come back to you. Just, Jamie, are you wanting to respond a little bit? Yeah. We'll just deal with it in two parts.
Yeah, clearly it's not an either-or decision here. We can protect our most valuable, most cherished native biodiversity in New Zealand, and we already do that to a large extent. Obviously we need to do better. But we don't have to have those species everywhere, and we don't have to have invasive mammals eradicated everywhere to do that. We know that. And we also know that there's a range of options, as I said, and I think we should move towards options that seek coexistence and seek the reduction of means that people increasingly find intolerable. I mean, you know, we've been having a conversation recently about the use of different poisons and chemicals. These things, not only in New Zealand but internationally, they are declining in terms of the public uptake for them. People don't want to be using this stuff in future. We know that a lot of them are extremely inhumane. So everyone's on the same side about that. We want to reduce the use of these sorts of things. We want to be looking at coexistence wherever possible, recognising that that's not always going to be the case. And sure, we're going to have situations and a systematic conservation planning framework where we can accommodate those range of different values, both that species have for themselves and their own lives, and also that those human values as well. I think that we can do that. We are moving in that direction.
Thank you. Morality is always going to get us going, isn't it? I am going to come back to you, Sue, but do you want to pick up on the theme we're on at the moment with the family?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to pick up on the point, and it was a point that you made earlier as well, around if we do just have these species, I guess, locked away in the areas where we're currently locking them away, and this is the more remote areas, this is the offshore islands, and as I've made the point before, that's only accessible to very few, and it tends to be very few wealthy people. So my concern with that approach is that we're actually marginalising and taking away the opportunity to have a connection, have a value for the majority of our population in the country, and that's something that concerns me. I know we can kind of say it's not an either or, but in reality, actually, for some things it is an either or. When we're talking about some species, I agree that a number of them it's not, but ultimately if we want to preserve some of our native species, we do have to make that call. And totally agree with the points that some of the panellists have made, that it's not our call to make, it's the entire population's call to make, but I'm fairly confident I know where they would end up.
Thank you. Are you...
Yeah,
It was
do you
a
mind?
two-part question, I'm sorry. So
Yeah,
did you want
that's
to respond
okay.
at all to... Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah.
Anyway, many of the forests were modified by these giant browsers and predators. And so the forest we have now is an incomplete and damaged forest that we are expecting our remaining native species, ground dwellers especially like the kiwi, to live in. And yet they're living in a forest with massive understory, which in the heavily browsed forest was missing. They're not living in their natural habitat. And in fact, would the suggestions of the late Dr. Corley be more appropriate that we allow alien mammalian browsers in to correct the loss of browse that we took with the Noah hunter?
So a question was directed to anyone in particular?
Thought on that.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Something similar obviously happened in North America, where there were different waves of environmental change over the millennia, and a kind of a broader understanding through paleoecology about how severe those changes were on the landscape, 10,000 years ago, is part of what sort of kicked off this round of reevaluation of conservation goals in the States, because we came to the realization that the target system that we were restoring to was in fact an artifact of this kind of Pleistocene extinctions and indigenous land management. So the particular case here about should use a proxy browser is not something that I'm qualified to talk about, but we are having similar discussions in North America about proxies for lost Pleistocene species. And I think that, again, I would say, it's not a one-size-fits-all answer. Maybe in some places you do it the way that Dr. Willett wants to do it now, and in some places you do an experiment where you try something like that. I think that if we can generally speaking, increase the conservation estate, then we have more opportunities to try different approaches simultaneously and in parallel. But it would require a lot of fencing here, which I understand is a challenge.
Jacqueline, you wanted to speak?
Yeah, I just really wanted to make a comment on this idea that seems to be out there, that what restoration projects are aiming for is some past kind of state. That may have been where some of the projects started off a long time ago, but in my experience, many of the projects now are way beyond that point. Climate change is happening. We've lost a whole range of species and we don't get them back. So clearly we want to be thinking about the context of what it was like, but it's not an achievable thing to head back there. And I think the restoration projects I've been involved with, North Motuara Island, for instance, they're aiming for native dominance and resetting the successional trajectory back to a more native dominated system, but not with the thought that's going to restore it to what it ever would be like before. So I think our thinking has moved a long way on what those reference systems are and what it is we're trying to achieve.
Since everyone's had a comment on this one, I feel left out. But just one very short point, follow-up to that's relevant to Bruce's opening. No one in this debate, this heuristic binary, reconciliation, restoration, can be described as laissez-faire. That is a very unfair characterisation of the debate. In fact, reconciliation ecology is about a suite of a greater diversity of management options, and more management in some places, less in others. So let's put that one to bed, eh? No one's asking for doing nothing.
No, I have a question about the previous comment about not trying to restore back to a certain time X, but instead of the indigenous dominance, which I think is a cool concept. So my question is if you do some modeling and you find that if you want to really support some indigenous bird, you know, having some eucalypts in there to feed them a huge amount of floral resource would really support that species. If you're not so concerned about going back to year 500, would you consider using non-natives as part of a complex design designed to support a large density and diversity of natives?
I can certainly say, I mean, in Wellington we are looking at that, and a lot of our nectar feeders do feed on eucalypts and banksia through the winter months. And likewise, when we have, you know, non-invasive pine species within our big reserves, actually these are the trees that are providing cavities for our kaka and for our kakariki, and we are saying actually that provides an important function that enhances our native species and doesn't have a detrimental impact. So we are definitely going to leave them in there, and we're not going to be removing them simply because they're an exotic. So I think particularly, I mean, I guess I'm talking from an urban context, but we absolutely do look at the role of the introduced species in terms of supporting our natives also.
Jane.
Just adding briefly to that, yeah, I mean, I agree with what Jacqueline's saying. In terms of restoration, we need to be a lot clearer about what we're talking about when we talk about restoration, because, you know, it depends often in different contexts who you're talking to. And, you know, one person will tell you we're aiming for a pre-human, one person a pre-European, another person will say we're trying to bring back the birds, or its ecological integrity, or its function, or its resilience, or its certain other cultural values. And we're often very confused, and we often just lump it all in and just say, well, we're restoring, and we don't even say what we're restoring to. The other thing is, I'll say that we still often, unfortunately, do use pre-human quite a lot, and that's integral to determination of significance, which is particularly how we determine significant natural areas in New Zealand. Representativeness, that's what we use, and it's almost always representative of a pre-human state. There's no denying that. So that is actually still an important part of restoration in New Zealand.
Thank you. There's a lady.
Liz McGrain, Federated Farmers. I've been really impressed by the breadth of provocative ideas down there. We're shipping our kakari out to Madagascar and passion in the panel. Just perhaps a couple of things. I picked up on Bruce's point that the bounce back can be really dramatic. If with a bit of help and a bit of investment, and certainly Zealandia would be an example of how rapid the bounce back in species where trees or birds can be. The panel was invited to speak to visions for 2100, and if perhaps Bruce or others, I'm kind of interested in having painted a vision for 2100, these public-private partnerships and the diversity of approaches and some innovation kicking in and room across the landscape or across the region for pristine Mother Nature over here, somewhat similar to what it might have used to look like, and innovation here. What might be a couple of the key steps or the key investments that you might look for us to be putting in place between now and 2100 or between now and 2020?
So would like to go. Bruce.
Well, is that working?
No. It needs to be pretty directional.
How's that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very directional, I think.
So thanks for that question. That's really important. There's a conference on in Napier next week which is going to partly address some of these questions, I think, in relation to the Cape to City project. The reality is that across New Zealand, part of our problem has been that different agencies have different agendas and different communities have different agendas. And, you know, the notion really of what I call regional restoration plans is what is needed, and Green in the audience here will remember this from the 2005 review of the New Zealand Biodiversity Strategy. One of the things we advocated was for the formation of regional restoration plans where all government agencies came together. So you don't just have a CMS from DOC and a regional policy statement from the regional council and a district council plan for something else. We've actually come together in consortia or aggregations at a regional scale, because the regional scale is critical because it's the one that links to the community of interest. So, you know, the Hawke's Bay, they know who they are and they know who their neighbours are and their friends are, and they want to work together to achieve a common goal. And so I think one of the ways of overcoming this is to have these regional scale attempts across the nation where there is a proper connection with the community of interest to get the result that we want. Now, one of the things that is sort of ironic about all of this is that we heard Bruce Wills on the Radio New Zealand just the other day making a comment about the issue of too many native birds on the landscape. You see, to me, that's the sign that we're actually getting to where we need to be, because you know what? For the most private landowners in New Zealand that were involved in that first 200 years of massive impact used to have those birds causing them all sorts of trouble when they were developing their farm. So my preference would be that it was the native birds that were causing them difficulty rather than a rook or some other exotic bird. But I'm also sure that if we take a regional approach and we work at the community of interest scale, that we can come to agreement about what is the appropriate level and number and disposition or distribution across the landscape. I just want to say one more thing, because I'll be cut off in a minute by Kathryn, is that no one in New Zealand is trying to turn back the clock. No one. We know that a huge number of species have become extinct. What in fact we're trying to do, in the words of the famous Caledonian forest restoration ecologist, Alan Featherston Watson, we're trying to restart the clock. And I think it's really important that we remember it. Not trying to turn it back, we're trying to get it started again to get that appropriate balance on our landscape. The balance that actually we went too far. And it's time to be more sympathetic in our management of our farmlands. And I'm a farmer's son, and I know what it means to your bottom line. More sympathetic in the management of the rural zone. Knowing that despite all the words we've heard here about holistic, of course holistic can mean the whole of the New Zealand scale. The whole of New Zealand is the scale at which we need to operate, because the urban ecologists and the urban restoration people need the peri-urban zone, and the peri-urban zone needs the rural zone, and the rural zone needs the wildland backcountry. And if things go wrong in any part of that system, we will not achieve the result that we need. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Any others here on what it's going to look like? I think you're trying to get at what are the steps going to be, even in the next 10 years, if this vision of 2100 or competing visions of 2100, what's the next significant step going to be? The family, you've got the mic, you want to speak? Or?
I've got the mic, I just don't have the answer.
Oh, okay.
But I want to pick up on Bruce's point, and I'm just going to talk anyway. But also in terms of what I think we need to put in place to reach that 2100 vision, and it's something we struggle with in Wellington. It's actually, so we've restored these species, we've brought them back. So then what in terms of the impacts of those species? And I think it's important for the rural area, I think it's important for the urban areas. We need to actually invest, and it's part of the People Nature Cities work that Bruce is leading actually, is having a look at and conversations with the community. If these species come back into our rural or our urban environments, are we prepared to have lots of kakariki picking up all of the, the blossoms from our fruit trees? And if they don't manage that, the kiri certainly will. And that's if the kaka don't actually ring bark the tree and kill it first. And we actually need to have a think about the implications of that and how we're going to manage them. And as Bruce said, where should they be? And there's this huge big gap at the moment that we don't know any of that. We don't know how these species are interacting with our rural or our urban environments because they've only been studied in forests. And I think in order to reach this sort of, state of harmony in 2100, we actually need to start thinking about those questions and starting to answer those questions. And I do think it ties into things like, what pollinators do we want in our rural landscape as well. So definitely research in that sort of area, and I guess you could call it reconciliation ecology in this country.
Thank you. What I heard from Wayne, though, was a very, very different picture from what the two of you just outlined. It was a very radically different picture. So Wayne, do you want to speak on what you see as being our next steps
I'm so pleased there's someone from Federated Farmers here. Thank you for coming. I work in South Africa. In South Africa, that nation has a conservation plan, which is a continent-wide zoning scheme. In modern parlance, this is called conservation planning. They design their landscapes empirically to match all the values of the stakeholders: farmers, conservationists, national parks, forestry, from the centre of the continent all the way to the sea and out into marine reserves. And they actively manage that at central government level. And they do that with tools developed in Australia, and Australia does it too. Incredibly, landscape, multi-stakeholder design. Doing different things in different places, peopled landscapes, reserved landscapes, restored landscapes, reconciled landscapes. It is.
Things exist, then that they exist in the exact right, correct place. If we have to move them to cope with climate change, that's fine with me. If the ecosystems have reshuffled and are in a different sort of constellation or organization because that's what's working now in a changed world, that's better than losing those species. So for me, the preservation of species trumps everything else. And if you have to go in there and genetically modify them in order to keep them going in 100 years from now, I am willing to consider that as well. I think that preserving species into the future is a duty, a generational duty. I also believe that our decisions about how we manage our lands and our seas and our freshwater should be democratic, and they should not be the tyranny of the experts. And so that means that although I personally believe that species and nature has an intrinsic right to exist, that means that that's sort of my, as you might say, my religious beliefs, that nature has an intrinsic right to exist, and I don't think that I should be able to trample over everybody else's opinions when we're making decisions just because I'm the one who works for the Department of Conservation or has a position of power. There needs to be a democratic decision making. And then my third sort of philosophical basis is the same as Wayne's, is about options. We have a certain set of values. I have my own, you have yours, we have our societal values. They may change in the future. Our grandchildren may have different values. Keeping options open is the best.
The magic bullet. And the next step in New Zealand is for us to write a conservation plan for the nation that has people like Federated Farmers and Department of Conservation. And do you know which organisation is closer to achieving this now and might be the network that makes this happen? The regional councils. I see great things happening in the regional councils in this space. They need it, but they need a national effort, and it'll be New Zealand's conservation plan.
So I was just going to make a comment more at the practical level. If you're wanting to think more about how you blend agricultural systems and get good outcomes for native biodiversity as well, I think we just need some more research and some better understandings of what we need to do. I mean, just the little bit of work we did looking at native bees and flies in that system, and part of that work was talking to farmers and getting their sense of what was going on and what acceptable changes in management practice might look for them. It turns out probably all they need to do is stop ploughing right to the very edges of their fields and leave some space that's not ploughed up, and then you can have your native bees and not actually impact on the bottom line of the farm at all. So I think, I mean, it's just a simple example of how thinking a bit more carefully about the whole system, you can actually get good outcomes for both. So, and I think it is true that for many ecologists, there was this divide of we all go and work off in the pristine native areas, not that they're pristine, but and then we left the agricultural scientists to work on improving production and things, and I think that's been a great mistake.
Thank you. I've got 3 questions I want to come to. There's a gentleman who's been waiting very patiently, but I think this lady might be pretty much working on this topic, thinking on this topic. Do you want to pick up in the first instance, the lady just here? Yeah, thank you, and the wonderful scarf. Oh, there you go. I haven't forgotten you, sirs.
My name is Yoko. Hello?
Very directional.
Hello? Shall I speak or
Swap.
the battery's gone?
Yeah.
Shall I just project?
Yes, you can.
Oh, great.
Thank you. My name's Yovana. I work for DOC, but this again is my personal view. So my background's in psychology, cultural psychology, and I have a question relating to a species that's often overlooked as the human species. And so I've been hearing a lot of conversations about values and value systems. And I was wondering what your perspectives were in terms of what do you think needs to happen in terms of the New Zealand value system regarding conservation, if that makes sense. Because, well, basically I want to know is where do you see people in 2100, if that makes sense. And if you had a magic wand, what would you want people to be able to see or understand, or what do you think needs to change in order for conservation to succeed? And what behaviours need to change as well?
Oh, I was going to talk about wolves, but I can talk about that later. Wolves, and parallels between wolf introduction, reintroduction, and kaka reintroduction. And how if you have a species the whole time, you're okay with it. But if some often from the government brings it back, you have a much different relationship with it. And so wolf reintroduction has been very difficult in the western United States because there's a sense among many farmers that the wolves were imposed upon them by the powers that be. And even, you know, if a cougar or bear kills one of their steers, that's the cost of doing business. But if a wolf does, that's taken as a personal insult. And I do wonder if the agricultural community had been more carefully listened to in the earlier stages of the wolf reintroduction process, if the wolf would have perhaps escaped becoming this political football that it has become. Because I think that in some ways it was rather imposed upon them. The government decided, okay, we're going to bring this back, and it just we're going to do it in Yellowstone, it's a park, it's great, and of course 5 minutes later the wolves were all over the countryside. I'm not saying that people will start shooting kaka and burying them in the backyard the way that they do with wolves in the West, but okay, well then, the parallels are real. But I suppose that it does relate to your question in a way, which is that I think no matter where you are in the world, better outcomes always come when you start by listening to all the people rather than start by trying to figure out how to persuade all the people. And I think, you know, conservation psychology sometimes they're like, oh, we need to convince all these people how to do that. We should do such and such. Let's get the conservation psychologists in here to figure us out how.